Ok, alors bonjour, rebonjour. On va donc continuer notre série de leçons sur la lecture et la compréhension de la Bible à partir des théories sur le traumatisme. La semaine dernière, nous avons commencé avec l'époque néo-assyrienne et aujourd'hui, nous allons donc nous intéresser au traumatisme, la destruction de Jérusalem, de l'exil et ainsi de suite. Voilà, donc je donne la parole à David Carr que je ne représente pas chaque fois parce que c'est un peu répétitif. Donc il va commencer immédiatement et puis à la fin, de nouveau, nous aurons un petit moment de questions si le temps le permet. Voilà, David.
Okay. Bonjour tout le monde. Je pense que je commence en anglais parce que j'ai un PowerPoint avec le français et Thomas a fait résumé de ma conférence. Since I can't presuppose that all of you were here for my first lecture, let me just start with my main thesis and what my focus of my overall lecture will be. My basic idea is that the Bible was fundamentally shaped by the experience of communal trauma. Not just the Old Testament, but the New Testament as well. Most of the focus of my lectures in this series is on the Old Testament. Now, when I say trauma, traumatisme in French, people can mean many different things. The definition that I gave in my first lecture is that trauma is an experience of disaster so intense that it explodes decisively a community's identity and haunts them in a way that's reflected indirectly in their behavior and their memory. And so I'll be talking about both dimensions in the talk today. In addition, I want to summarize a definition of trauma that I gave before by Kathy Carruth, where she says trauma is a terror. I'm sorry, I'm working with the French now. Indicible, a history which has no place. And that concept of history that has no place will be important for my talk today. So much for my basic idea and my definition of trauma. Now to an anticipation of what I will talk about today. This lecture is the first of 2 lectures in this series at the Collège de France, which concentrate on what I want to say is the most traumatic event in biblical history, in the history of the Hebrew Bible at least. And that is the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile of many of its inhabitants to Babylon. And I will try to show that this event is traumatic, not so much just because of what we see written explicitly about it in the Bible, but also because of things that the Bible apparently cannot talk about. That the exile, as I will say, is the one event in the Bible that people could not directly describe. And this makes for the interesting fact that the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, was formed by an event that the Bible itself couldn't talk about. In many ways, you can see this already in the way many biblical scholars like me and Professor Römer and others talk about the history of the Bible. We divide the Bible into 3 main periods: pre-exilic history, the exile, and the post-exile. Everything revolves around this event, the exile, that is not ever explicitly described in the Bible itself. So the aim of this lecture, of this conference, is to focus on the specifically traumatic character of the exile. How do we really know that the exile was so traumatic for the formation of the Bible? And then this will prepare for my lecture in the coming week, where I will look at how this traumatic event, the exile, which the Bible couldn't talk about, was actually the context in which we see the rise of the Torah, of the Pentateuch, to become the center of the biblical collection, which is really in many ways what makes the Hebrew Bible quite distinct compared to many other comparable ancient Near Eastern collections. So now let me shift to talk some about just the events surrounding the exile, starting with a map slide that shows you Israel to the north and Judah to the south. Here I realize I'm summarizing things many of you already know, but let's just get all on the same page. First of all, in my lecture today, I'm not focusing on the focus of last week's lecture, which is the northern kingdom of Israel. That northern kingdom was destroyed by the Assyrian Empire. By the time we get to the historical period that is the focus of today's lecture, we're focusing instead on Judah, the people to the south, who had their kingdom, their capital in Jerusalem. And what I'm going to be talking about, you need to click. What I'm going to be talking about is actually two stages of trauma that impacted the formation of the Hebrew Bible. Colleen, you need to keep. The first, I'm sorry. The first was the destruction of Israel and the imprisonment of Judah for many years. And then the second, which is the focus of, keep going. The second part was the 6th century destruction of Judah by the Babylonians. Now, in this second stage, which happened after the Assyrians had dominated Judah for hundreds of years, the Babylonians initially just subjected Judah to about a little bit over a decade of oppression. And then when Judah rebelled one too many times, they laid siege to the city of Jerusalem and eventually conquered it. And when they conquered it, they were ruthless in how they destroyed, they subdued the people. They blinded the king of the time, Zechariah, after killing his children before his eyes. And then they took most of the inhabitants of Jerusalem, possibly some of the surrounding towns, into exile, forced exile in remote parts of Babylon. Weeks later, the Babylonians systematically destroyed Jerusalem, pulling down the wall of Jerusalem and burning the temple of Jerusalem, the palace, and other buildings. And this meant that the supposedly invulnerable city of Jerusalem was nothing but rubble. Its inhabitants either killed, starved, or in exile. And there were at least 2 waves of people living in forced exile in Babylon now. Those who'd been exiled 10 years before by the Babylonians during an earlier rebellion, and now some more people who were exiled after the destruction of the city. These 2 waves of exiles in Babylon represented virtually all of the elite leaders and craftspeople of Jerusalem and Judah that might stir up some kind of rebellion against Babylon. The Bible does record that there were some poor of the land left in Judah, and there's archaeological evidence that this was a considerable group. But the top had been skimmed off of Judean society, first in 596 BCE, and then again in 587. Now, when you contemplate this, first just the destruction of a city, and then the forced exile of a number of people, it's hard to imagine how such events wouldn't traumatize people. Thousands of people had died in battle, more had starved in besieged cities, and by the end, the land was in ruins, with much of its population either dead or in exile. But what I want to go on to talk about here is another dimension of this experience of suffering. One thing that I talked about last week, and I want to reinforce this week, is that people can often overlook in discussions of trauma how trauma can make some people just suffer and other people actually be traumatized in a technical sense. And so I just realized I've talked for a while. Maybe I should pause now and let Thomas summarize, and I'll go to this section.
Voilà, donc petit résumé. Aujourd'hui, nous allons nous intéresser en fait à un deuxième choc. Nous avons parlé la semaine dernière de la destruction de Samarie en 722. Aujourd'hui, ce sera autour de ce qu'on appelle l'exil. L'exil en fait babylonien, puisqu'il y a d'autres exils, et qui est si important que les exégètes, les biblistes ont pris l'habitude de diviser en fait toute l'histoire d'Israël à partir de cette idée d'une époque pré-exilique, une époque exilique et une époque post-exilique, toujours évidemment en pensant à l'exil babylonien qui a eu lieu déjà avant la destruction de Jérusalem en 596 et ensuite dans une deuxième vague en 587. Ce qui est important à noter aussi, c'est que, en effet, c'est certainement l'événement le plus traumatisant qu'on peut imaginer dans la Bible, mais curieusement, les récits bibliques ne décrivent pas vraiment l'exil même, c'est-à-dire la déportation, etc. Il n'y a que des brefs résumés sans qu'on donne des détails. On donne des détails sur le siège de Jérusalem, mais l'exil même est en quelque sorte presque un peu omis au niveau de la description, peut-être à cause justement de cet effet traumatique. Et ce que va présenter maintenant M. Carr, c'est qu'il faut encore distinguer sans doute des attitudes ou des réactions par rapport à l'exil. Il y a à la fois, mais pas probablement chez les mêmes personnes, il y a la souffrance, bien sûr, mais pour d'autres, c'est vraiment un traumatisme et il va nous donner maintenant les définitions qui expliquent ça de manière plus détaillée.
Merci beaucoup. So, I was about to say, what is it that helps distinguish a certain event that's very painful from traumatizing one person or group and not traumatizing another? And there's a psychologist, Ronnie Janhoff-Bullman, who's written a book called Shattered Assumptions, who suggests that the one crucial difference that makes something traumatic is that it shatters an individual or group's most fundamental assumptions about themselves and their world. And so everything depends for a group or individual on what their assumptions about the world are, on whether those assumptions are shattered by an event or not. In this case, this helps us understand, I think, another important dimension of Judah's trauma at the hands of the Babylonians. The pre-exilic Judeans who experienced this destruction and exile had at least two main core beliefs that we can see reflected in the Bible. One is Zion theology, which is briefly summarized as the idea that Jerusalem was God's habitation and therefore could not be defeated by any other enemy army. And the second basic assumption was the idea that the Davidic monarchy would be eternal, that God would always ensure that a descendant of David would be on the throne of Jerusalem's monarchy. These two basic assumptions, these core assumptions of ancient Judah were connected. The belief in Jerusalem's invulnerability was linked to a belief in the permanence of the Davidic monarchy over Jerusalem. So, and both of these core assumptions, the idea of Jerusalem's invulnerability and the permanence of the Davidic monarchy, were shattered, were destroyed by the Babylonian attack in 587-86. The Bible preserves some cries of Judeans who faced this catastrophe. An entire biblical book, many of you know, is called Lamentations and mourns the destruction of Jerusalem, starting with an exclamation over how the city, who's now personified in the book as a woman, has fallen, saying, "How deserted she sits, the city who was once full of people." And then the rest of the book alternates between descriptions of devastated Jerusalem with poems where Jerusalem herself is quoted as speaking, as in this poem, "Look, Yahweh, I'm in distress. My guts boil over. My heart turns within me, for I've been such a rebel. How rebellious I've been. Outside, the sword bereaves. Inside the city is like death." That's Lamentations 1:20. Now, Jerusalem's exclamation here, "I've been such a rebel, how rebellious I've been," is one of numerous places where texts from the exilic period that I'm discussing here manifest that phenomenon of self-blame that I've talked about in my last lecture as a consistent marker of trauma. So much like Hosea and his northern audience over a century earlier had blamed Israel for being oppressed by Assyria, they blamed themselves for Assyrian attack. Now Judeans, in the wake of Jerusalem's destruction, blamed themselves for that destruction at the hands of the Babylonians. We find similar cries in the book of Psalms, and this time over the loss of the Davidic kingship, that other shattered assumption. A Judean author concluded an early collection of Psalms with a lament about this loss in Psalm 89. And the Psalm starts, hopefully, with a quote of the Davidic covenant, past promises to David to preserve his line. But then the rest of Psalm 89 shows how the Babylonian attack has shattered this trust in God's protection of David's line. And the psalmist cries to God, "You've removed the scepter from David's hand and hurled his throne to the ground. You've cut short the days of his youth and covered him with shame." And the psalmist then confronts God with more questions. "How long, O God, will you hide yourself forever? How long will your anger burn?" And it concludes by speaking directly of God's broken promises. "Where is your steadfast love, which you swore to David in truth?" There's an anthropologist who spent his career, Kai Erickson, studying trauma. And he speaks how such traumatic events for communities, that's his focus, destroy a basic trust in the goodness of the world that people gradually build in childhood, that's part of what makes an event traumatic. And we can see this reflected in these cries at the end of Lamentations and at the end of this collection of Psalms. Saying to God, "Why have you forsaken us so long?" And at the end of Psalm 89, "Where is your steadfast love?" I'll pause here for you to...
Il y a deux éléments importants qui expliquent des réactions de traumatisme par rapport aux événements de 587. C'est justement l'idée que ce qu'on peut appeler la théologie sioniste, à savoir que Sion, la montagne de Yahvé, sera en effet à jamais défendu par le Dieu qui y habite. Et l'autre pilier, c'est l'idée de la durée éternelle, entre guillemets, de la dynastie davidique. Donc ça, c'est deux piliers en fait qui sont profondément bouleversés parce que le roi est en exil et puis Sion est détruit et occupé par les Babyloniens, ce qui évidemment va refléter une mise en question de la conception du monde, et c'est ça justement ce qui va provoquer des attitudes de traumatisme. On peut voir dans les Lamentations, dans le livre des Lamentations, une sorte d'auto-accusation, comme nous l'avons vu la semaine dernière, où oser accuser ses destinataires d'être coupables de ce qui est arrivé. Là, dans les Lamentations, en fait, la personne qui parle s'accuse elle-même d'avoir été en révolte contre son Dieu. Et ensuite, la question de la dynastie davidique se reflète dans le psaume 89, où justement le psalmiste demande à Yahvé pourquoi, en effet, il a mis fin à cette ligne dynastique qui est en effet en contradiction avec la promesse d'une dynastie éternelle. Donc, professeur Carr a cité un anthropologue, Kai Erickson, qui a montré en effet comment le trauma peut en effet naître au moment où une construction du monde dans laquelle on met toute sa confiance est tout d'un coup bouleversée et ne semble plus fonctionner.
Merci. So with this work by Jandolf Bullman on shattered assumptions and with the evidence of self-blame, I think many of us would assume that for these Judeans, the destruction of Jerusalem, the death of many of their loved ones, the loss of the Davidic king, would constitute the biggest trauma in the formation of the Bible. And certainly it was, as I've suggested, very important. But I want to suggest that, as I hinted at the beginning of my lecture, that there was yet a deeper trauma to be experienced in being exiled from the land of Israel. That for the Judeans, apparently, that forcible removal from the land of Judah to Babylon was even more traumatic than the destruction of Jerusalem and the loss of the Davidic king. Now, as I mentioned before, thousands of Judeans were removed forcibly from their land. Many of them had never lived anywhere but Judah, had probably lived most of their lives within a few miles of Jerusalem. And now they found themselves settled in relatively depopulated parts of Babylon. That's how the Babylonians settled forcibly removed people, at a town named Tel Aviv, which is mentioned in the book of Ezekiel, or also in Judah town, in a set of cuneiform texts, one of which is pictured here, which we now have, which record the names of Judean exiles in our legal contracts where they conducted business with each other during the years of Babylonian exile and in the decades afterward. We now know from these recently published cuneiform texts that these exiled Judeans, either learned enough cuneiform or hired people to work with them, and had started, some of them at least, had started to assimilate into Babylonian culture. Before they were removed from the land of Israel, these people were at the top of society. They were the priests and officers and elites of Judah. But now, once they were moved by the Babylonians into the land, they were foreigners in a strange land, trying to survive and enduring taunts by their Babylonian captors. Now, as I've suggested earlier, one of the deepest marks of the experience of trauma of this Babylonian exile is the fact that the Bible says almost nothing about it. As one specialist in the study of trauma, Nina Thomas, has said, the most reliable mark of trauma is the inability to remember. End of quote. And in fact, this mark is even more prominent in collective trauma of communities than it is for individual trauma. There's much debate within trauma literature about loss of memory by traumatized individuals. I myself can say from my own personal experience, and I'll talk more about this next time, I have experienced a loss of memory related to a traumatic event. But communities are even more characterized by being unable, at least for a few decades, to talk about a traumatic event than individuals are. One quick example is the experience of Nazi genocide of the Jewish communities of Europe during World War II. It's hard to imagine right now, but when historians have traced discussions of this whole event, it actually was not discussed almost at all for the first decades after World War II. It was not even mentioned in the state of Israel until the trial of Eichmann much. It was only decades after the World War II experience that people began to be able to speak about the Shoah, about the genocide of Jews, and start to talk about what it meant. And what I'm suggesting here is that the gap in the Bible represents a similar gap. Because the Bible's history, as we have it now, extends all the way up to the beginning of the Babylonian exile at the end of 2 Kings. And then it picks up again at the end of the Babylonian exile with the Persian ruler's Cyrus's edict that the Jews could start to return and rebuild their temple. The only exilic event that's explicitly reported is a 3-verse fragment about the end of the imprisonment of the exiled king, Jehoiakim, in 2 Kings 25, 27 to 29. Otherwise, this Babylonian exile remains a black hole in the biblical tradition. Only hundreds of years later do Jews start to write stories about figures like Daniel, say the legends in Daniel 2-6, who is said to live in exile. But those stories are clearly marked as way later than the event itself. Otherwise, as I've said, the exile is a gap in Israel's collective memory. So, this gap, I suggest, may be an indication of what was truly traumatic about the Babylonian onslaught. Of course, the destruction of Jerusalem was devastating, and we see this reflected in Lamentations. And the loss of the Davidic rule was painful too, although there was hope it would someday be restored. But the Bible is able to talk about these events. These are things ancient Judeans could describe, painful as they were. In contrast to speechless terror or history that has no place, to quote Kathy Caruth's description of trauma, these awful events in Judah's history were history that had a place. But that's not true for the Babylonian exile. Aside from some prophecies by Ezekiel, which I'll discuss shortly, in the several verse fragment at the end of 2 Kings about Jehoiakim, we only have one significant text that speaks explicitly out of the experience of exile, and that's Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and we wept at the memory of Zion. On the poplars there we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked us to sing them a song. Our tormentors asked for merriment. Quote, sing us one of the songs of Zion, end quote. How could we sing a song of Yahweh on foreign soil? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand wither, may my tongue remain stuck to my palate, if I do not keep you in mind, if I do not count Jerusalem the greatest of my joys. End of quote. This memory of Jerusalem was one thing that bound the Judean exiles together, even as they lived in disparate towns across central Babylon. Most of these exiles probably never returned, dying on foreign soil. They lived in a world where the average life expectancy, as we heard in a conference over the last couple of days, was probably no longer than about 30 or 40 years, and the exile lasted 50 years. So the people who were able to survive that period of time were the exception rather than the rule. And by the time Babylon fell, the sons of the exile, B'nai Golah, as they called themselves, were mostly children of those who'd once lived in Judah. They were exiles who had actually never seen their homeland, and their only bound to each other was the connection, often through their parents, to Jerusalem and the land of Israel. So in my lecture last week, I cited a study of trauma by Tarantelli that describes individual trauma as an explosion of the self, so severe that there's no I left to perceive and remember it. So if you're a traumatized person, or by extension, a traumatized community, your basic capacity for self-identification and judgment is destroyed by trauma. There's no way for you even to experience a traumatic event. And that's why memory of a period or inability to speak specifically about it, even if you can remember it, is impaired. I'm suggesting that the Babylonian exile exploded the Judean communal self. The catastrophe was so extreme that there were no resources even for writing about it. There was no institution like a kingship that might then call forth a history of exile. There was no sort of Sitzimleben for the writing of that history. In earlier times, there were the monarchies of North and South, and they adopted writing to preserve and spread their own stories about themselves, often in revised form. The biblical books of Samuel and Kings are built around, at least, sources of such royal histories. But the Assyrians destroyed the kingdom of Israel, and the Babylonians destroyed Judah. And then there was no centralized institution to take their place in exile. And as a result, we see no new writings about communal history during that period. We first start to see new written Jewish histories when Judeans begin to return to Jerusalem, regain power over their own community gradually, and form a coherent, post-exilic, Jerusalem-centered community. So between pre- and post-exile, there is no Judean communal self to write or read its own story. The pre-exilic monarchy had been obliterated by Babylon, and the post-exilic temple-centered community was not yet born. And that is why we have so little narrative directly about what it was like to live, struggle, and work in the Judean towns in central Babylon.
Nous avons très peu d'informations sur ce qui s'est passé en exil. Nous pouvons reconstruire qu'il y avait des villes, notamment grâce à des tablettes cunéiformes qui parlent d'une ville de Nouvelle-Judée, éditée entre autres par André Römer. Et puis nous avons un texte dans le livre d'Ézéchiel qui nous parle d'une ville Tel Aviv, pas la Tel Aviv actuelle bien sûr, mais ce qui est intéressant en fait, on n'a pas de texte qui décrivent ce qui se passe. Et selon le professeur Carr, c'est typique de ce qui se passe dans un contexte de traumatisme, c'est-à-dire en fait, il y a une sorte de refus de mémoire ou d'oubli. On peut tout à fait comparer à ce qui s'est passé en fait avec le génocide des Juifs, la Shoah, dont on a en effet commencé à parler seulement des décennies après la Deuxième Guerre. Donc il y a une sorte de refus de mémoire ou de blanc de mémoire, ce qui est tout à fait comparable puisque nous n'avons pas des textes en fait qui nous décrivent ce qui s'est passé. Donc entre 587 et 539, plus qu'une génération. Pas beaucoup de choses. Trois versets à la fin des rois qui parlent de la réhabilitation du roi Joachim qui sort de prison, accepté à la place, à la table du roi de Babylone. Mais c'est à peu près tout. Nous avons le psaume 137, mais qui peut être aussi écrit bien plus tardivement. Et donc c'est seulement après qu'on va mettre en scène des figures comme Daniel lors de l'exil babylonien, mais là de nouveau nous sommes dans des situations bien plus tardives. Ce qui est important aussi, c'est que durant cette époque dite de l'exil, il n'y a pas vraiment d'institution où on peut imaginer qu'il y a le lieu approprié pour pouvoir écrire des histoires. Il n'y a pas de cours. On ne sait pas quelle est la situation des exilés. Et puis, ce qu'on observe aussi dans le texte biblique, c'est seulement à partir de l'époque perse qu'on va avoir une autre historiographie post-exilique ou perse.
Okay. So now I want to turn to tracing, even though we don't have explicit descriptions of the exile in biblical texts, marks of that exile, especially in texts that biblical scholars agree came from the exile or from the wake of the exile. Before I do that, though, I just want to say, first of all, that despite the fact that we have almost nothing about the exile, it appears as if, in many ways, the exile proved to be the most decisive event in the formation of the Bible. And one way it was so formative is the fact that the exile, in gathering the elites of ancient Judah and moving them to Babylon, created an unusually literate community for the ancient world. It was artificially high percentage of people who were literate. There's discussion and disagreement among biblical scholars about exactly how many people would have been able to read and write in the land of Israel during the pre-exilic period. And of course, there are also different levels of literacy. But I am among those, and many specialists agree with me, who believe that the number of people in pre-exilic Judah who were capable of writing and reading extended literary texts was quite small. At that time, in the pre-exilic period, literacy was quite low, even with alphabetic texts. Be that as it may, when we get to the exile, many of the people, small group of people who were literate in pre-exilic Judah were now in the majority in exiled Babylon. So it created, in a way, almost, it's probably an exaggeration to say a university, but an unusually learned group of people who were then trying to understand and process their traumatic experience, partly through writing. And we see the impact of this in terms of the shaping of the broader Hebrew Bible. Just generally, for example, prophetic texts, which like Hosea or Isaiah or Amos or Jeremiah or Ezekiel, which previously probably played a fairly marginal role in the Judean literary tradition, came to play a much more central role because they were used to try to understand why the exile had happened. Also, the history of the monarchy was at least revised, if not written, during the period of exile to try to come to an understanding of how these events could have happened. But in particular, I want to talk now about some specific marks of exile in texts that biblical scholars generally agree to come from the exile. But before I turn to those texts, I want to discuss a phenomenon that's quite common for people who suffer from trauma. And that is the tendency of survivors to disassociate themselves from the self who underwent the suffering. This was already observed by a scholar who studied survivors of the atomic attack on Hiroshima, Richard Lifton, who said, extreme trauma creates a second self. There is a traumatized self that is created. So often survivors of trauma speak about the person who underwent the trauma as if they were another person. They use pronouns like he or she when talking about themselves because they can't quite identify with the person who went through that catastrophic experience. And what I want to suggest here is we can see a possible reflection of this dissociation in exilic texts in several biblical traditions that likely come from the exile. For example, the book of Lamentations, which I quoted above, features a daughter Zion who embodies the suffering communal self of the exiles. And they speak of this daughter Zion as if she's another figure, even though she really represents the exiles themselves. So also, the books of Jeremiah and of Ezekiel, both of which were formed in the midst of the Babylonian exile, are distinguished by the way they develop extended, almost sort of biographical pictures of the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And in doing so, they create this picture of suffering prophets that reflected the suffering of the exiles, so that the prophetic personae, the prophetic persons who are depicted in these books, is a reflection of the suffering self of the exiles who are reading the books. In these cases, so once again, exilic biblical books use separate figures to describe a suffering the exiles couldn't speak of directly. Finally, the portion of the book of Isaiah that scholars generally agree came from the exile or the wake of the exile, second Isaiah, in Isaiah 40 through 45, feature another figure, the servant of Yahweh, that symbolizes, again in a disassociated way, both the suffering and the hope of the Judean exiles. As in the case of daughter Zion, this servant figure is an individual who symbolizes the community. Early in 2nd Isaiah, God even addresses the community of Jacob, Israel, as God's servant, saying, "You, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I've chosen, the offspring of Abraham, my friend, saying to you, you are my servant, I have chosen you and not cast you off." So this is a direct identification of the servant as the community. But as the prophecy continues, we hear of a servant that sometimes seems to be an individual within the community. For example, Isaiah 42, 1-4 is the first of several servant songs where God introduces a servant, apparently unknown to the text audience, saying, "Here is my servant whom I support, my chosen one in whom I delight. I've put my spirit in him, and he'll bring the nations justice." Or later in 2nd Isaiah, the servant himself speaks of his mission, saying, "God says to me, you're my servant, Israel, in whom I'll be glorified." And this seems again to identify the servant with the community of Israel, but then he implies that his mission is to help bring Israel back to God, saying, "And now Yahweh says, who formed me in the womb to be a servant, to bring Jacob back to him, that Israel might be gathered in him." And then verses later, we hear that the servant suffered much of the same rejection that the prophets had, where he says, "I gave my back to those who struck me and my cheeks to those who pulled my beard." Finally, in what is often referred to as the Song of the Suffering Servant in Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12. The text describes how other peoples, kings and others, are amazed at how God restores this suffering servant, starting with God's exclamation, "My servant shall succeed." And then the poem turns to quote a group, maybe kings and nations, as they marvel at what happened to this servant. But they believe that this suffering person, the one they thought was cursed by God, actually was bearing the punishment of their own sins. And the text goes on to describe concrete things this servant has suffered quietly, taken away by a perversion of justice, cut off from the land of the living, and placed in a grave for the wicked, although he'd done no violence or engaged in deceit. And the poem concludes by saying God will restore this servant, and quoting a promise from God to make the servant's suffering atone for others. Now, this suffering servant song stands as one of the most famous poems in the Bible, and yet also is quite controversial. Early Christians took the poem to be a prophecy of Jesus' crucifixion, telling of how Jesus bore the sin of many, and Jesus' death was a sacrifice for sin. Meanwhile, Jewish communities have typically understood this poem to be about a collective servant, about the community of Israel. Recent historical scholarship has failed to resolve the problem. Just when one scholar has identified reasons to see the servant as an individual, another argues the servant is actually really the community. And on the one hand, the servant seems to speak for himself and have specific experiences of suffering as an individual. But on the other hand, 2nd Isaiah repeatedly connects the servant with the community of Israel, the people of Israel. How might we explain this mix of data? Some favoring an individual approach and other a collective approach. I suggest, following a suggestion of a student of mine, Carolyn Perry, that we might use trauma theory to affirm both. Yes, on one level, Isaiah 40 to 55 talks of a suffering individual, like Jeremiah or Ezekiel, who suffered for his message and was rejected by those around him. And this figure, like other prophets in the Bible, speaks of being commissioned by God. Yet, as in the cases of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the exiles come to see their own suffering in that of this anonymous exilic prophet. So, apparently the exiles could not speak or write much directly about their experience of life in exile. This was the gap of memory I talked about before. But speaking in a disassociated way about the suffering of Yahweh's servant provided them a way to speak of their suffering as if it was about a separate person, when it was also about themselves. The suffering servant embodied the exile's pain and restoration. And this servant stands alongside figures like the daughter Zion or Jeremiah or Ezekiel as disembodied, disassociated ways that traumatized exiles could speak of their suffering without actually speaking about it.
Donc, nous n'avons, comme l'a dit M. Carr, nous avons peu de textes qui traitent directement de l'exil, mais on peut quand même imaginer qu'il y a un certain nombre de textes qui reflètent la situation de l'exil et aussi le traumatisme qui est lié. Il a rappelé que les recherches sur le traumatisme ont montré que très souvent on observe une sorte de dissociation de l'identité de la personne qui a vécu une situation traumatisante. Ce qui amène que souvent, au lieu de parler en je, les personnes vont parler en il ou en elle, donc une sorte de se désincarner par rapport à cette souffrance. Et on peut comparer cela dans la Bible, d'abord aux Lamentations, où on parle de la fille de Sion, qui est peut-être une figure justement qui exprime le traumatisme de l'exil, On peut aussi observer que dans les livres prophétiques, alors qu'avant on n'a aucune information biographique sur les prophètes, chez Jérémie et Ézéchiel, tout d'un coup on va construire des biographies, mais qui sont peut-être des biographies qui permettent à la communauté de s'identifier d'une certaine manière aussi aux expériences qui sont projetées sur les prophètes. Et le cas peut-être le plus complexe et le plus intéressant, c'est ce qu'on appelle les chants du serviteur, qui se trouvent dans la deuxième partie du livre d'Ésaïe. Il y a différents de ces chants que M. Carr vous a projetés. On a toujours discuté en fait de savoir comment il faut comprendre ce serviteur, et dans la discussion, deux positions se sont affrontées. Il y a ceux qui disent qu'il faut avoir une compréhension collective, à savoir que c'est un groupe qui se cache derrière ce serviteur, alors que d'autres ont toujours dit que c'est en effet une figure individuelle, donc puis après il faut savoir avec qui il faut l'identifier. Mais la proposition du professeur Carr, c'est de dire que c'est peut-être une fausse opposition si on applique la théorie du traumatisme, puisqu'en effet, derrière la collectivité, ou c'est une manière aussi pour les individus de se trouver en fait dans la collectivité. Donc à la fois c'est le groupe qui reflète sa souffrance, tout en se construisant en fait un porte-parole. Voilà.
Okay, merci. Because time is short, I want to spend only a little bit of time talking about one more mark of trauma in explicitly exilic texts, and it appears in texts that I've already discussed. It relates to the common experience of many people who experience trauma as starting to recover from the experience of trauma by finding someone or a group of people who witness their trauma, who understand and hear their story and recognize it as real. This is something that happened with many survivors of the Nazi concentration camps. It's happened with many people in individual experiences of trauma. Anthropologist Lisa Malky has summarized how Hutu refugees in an earlier conflict in Africa often were very anxious to try to find foreign journalists who would listen to their story and recognize it as having some truth to it. So different groups, whether individuals or groups, are often looking for a witness. And one of the phenomena in the suffering servant poem that I discussed just now is the way in which it imagines a situation where the servant who has appeared in earlier parts of 2nd Isaiah, already in the Isaiah 43 through 5, where God says, all the peoples of the world will behold the glory of Yahweh, and then 42, 1 to 4, where it talks about how the servant will bring justice to the peoples of the world. And then finally in the suffering servant song, it imagines how kings and nations will behold the servant that I was just discussing as a symbol of the suffering Babylonian exiles. That servant will be witnessed by nations of the world, and those people will be amazed when they behold the success and restoration of God's servant Israel. In fact, much of the suffering servant song represents sort of a witness to the experience of this servant's suffering and his eventual restoration. And I suggest that this may be another way in which this particular exilic text or post-exilic text sort of provides an imaginary situation where the traumatized Babylonian exiles imagine foreign people witnessing their suffering and validating it. So in summary, I've touched on several aspects of trauma scholarship which highlight central characteristics of trauma, including trauma of groups, and show how they're reflected in parts of the Bible, especially texts that scholars agree are exilic. First of all, we certainly see in Lamentations, 2nd Isaiah, and other exilic texts, a large dose of self-blame, typical of trauma survivors. Second, insofar as trauma is marked by explosion of a group's core beliefs, shattered assumptions, Judeans already had experienced trauma in the destruction of Jerusalem, which they had believed was invulnerable and also the end of the Davidic monarchy, which they thought was permanent. Third, the forced exile of many inhabitants of Jerusalem seems, as I've said, to represent an even deeper trauma, for there's a half-century gap in the collective memory of the Bible about the exile in terms of direct description. Fourth, we see in several clearly exilic texts the kind of disassociation that's typical of trauma victims, where the exiled Judeans represent their suffering textually through disassociated figures like daughter Zion, or the prophetic personae of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, or the complex individual communal figure of the suffering servant. And fifth, we see in the scene of the Song of the Suffering Servant an imaginary picture of other nations bearing witness to the trauma suffered by Judah in the form of the suffering servant. And in this way, the traumatized Judean exiles could imagine their trauma being recognized by other people of the world who had power. All this underlines the specifically traumatic dimension of the destruction of Jerusalem, and especially the trauma affected by the forced decades-long removal of Judeans from their homeland. And since we modern or postmodern readers of the Bible live in a world often characterized by frequent mobility, it's hard for us sometimes to recognize how ancient people like Israel could be traumatized in this way by forced relocation, even as this is quite a reality in our world today, very prominent in Europe, to be sure. But we need to be sensitive to the specific cultural shape of trauma for an agricultural, land-defined group like ancient Judah. For Judah, losing their land and their holy city was like a person losing their body. And the biblical traditions show signs of the traumatic impact of this disembodiment of Judah by the Babylonians. Disassociation, gap in memory, imagining international witnesses to their suffering. In my lecture next week, I'll develop this picture further, showing how exiles took older traditions about homeless, landless figures like Abraham and Moses and reframed those traditions into a Torah, a Pentateuch, that could truly become a Bible for exiles. But now, I thank you for your attention.
Juste encore quelques mots. Ce qui est important aussi pour comprendre ces chants du serviteur souffrant, c'est toujours l'appel à des nations, à d'autres groupes qui sont appelés à témoigner à la fois la souffrance, ce qui reflète aussi la nécessité et la difficulté pour un groupe ou des individus traumatisés de pouvoir en fait enfin parler de sa souffrance et de son traumatisme. Et c'est justement ce rôle-là qui jouent les nations ou les autres dans ces chants du serviteur. Ensuite, M. Carr a résumé son cours en insistant sur le fait que même si aujourd'hui nous vivons dans une situation, surtout en Europe, de grande mobilité, on passe facilement d'un pays à l'autre, il y a les TGV, il y a les avions. À l'époque, évidemment, d'être exilé pour un petit paysan judéen qui se retrouve à Babylone, c'est quelque chose qui est en effet comme une perte d'identité, comme une perte aussi de sa personne, de son corps. Et donc, il ne faut pas sous-estimer cela. Et la semaine prochaine, nous allons continuer sur cette interrogation en se posant la question pourquoi dans le Pentateuch il y a deux personnages principaux, Abraham et Moïse, qui sont tous les deux des personnages sans pays d'une certaine manière, et comment en fait la mémoire de ces personnes-là va construire la Torah, le Pentateuch en fait comme une sorte de document fondateur pour des exilés ou de la diaspora. Voilà, maintenant on peut prendre encore quelques minutes pour des questions. Si vous en avez, on peut faire les... Oui, alors là, et puis... Oui.